I'd like to bring to the stage California Senator Kamala Harris.
Oh my God. Oh my goodness. Look what you, oh, this is fantastic. Oh my goodness.
Well, we waited for them to sit down.
Have shown up.
Now all right, well, let's dive right into it.
Okay. Look what you've done.
I'm pretty
This
proud.
is pretty extraordinary.
I'm really
this
proud.
is really phenomenal.
People came a long way.
This is
they took off
truly
work.
what Maya Angelou had in mind when she talked about phenomenal women.
Yes.
This is extraordinary.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's talk about something serious, which is that in the era of marijuana legalization in blue states such as California,
Yes.
and in other places in the U.S., what will you do as president to address the historic harm that has been done to our communities of color, and the deleterious effects of the war on drugs, supported by many Democrats decades past, and the expansion of the industrial prison complex, what Michelle Alexander called the new Jim Crow?
That's right. So let's start with the fact I am in favor of and believe strongly that we have got to legalize marijuana. And it has led to the criminalization of and contributed to the problem of mass incarceration in our country, and has led disproportionately to the criminalization of young black and brown men in this country. So there's that. There is the broader point about the failed war on drugs. There's no question it was a failure. And part of the problem was that what is essentially a public health issue became a criminal justice issue. And then now, thankfully, some have evolved around the opioid issue. But look, where were they when we had what was called the crack epidemic, right? And so we know that this is a system, in particular around the criminalization of drug use and possession, that has been infected by racial bias. And we have to speak truth about that. We have to speak truth in terms of the way that enforcement happened and what the result was in terms of mass incarceration. So one, we need to decriminalize and actually legalize marijuana use. Second, we need to deal with the real issue, which is the issue of undiagnosed, untreated trauma, in particular in poor communities and communities of color, which leads to predictable behaviors, including self-medication, because of a lack of public health resources in those communities, a lack of mental health resources in those communities. And I will tell you, as President of the United States, one of the things that I will implement is that we have mental health care on demand, and we have drug treatment on demand, because right now, even for those folks who are short of a crisis, let's say a suicidal episode, and then they can go to an emergency room, short of that, folks need to wait in line 3 to 6 months to get treatment. And so what ends up happening, during that period of time, they are still feeling the effects of their addiction and are exposed then to the possibility of being incarcerated. So all of these issues are connected. But one of the big failures of the government of the United States has been the failure to address mental health and the need for significant mental health treatments. And the other is to address the years of trauma that have existed because of exposure to violence and the trauma that poverty produces that has been undiagnosed and untreated. And I would absolutely put in place a priority around that, including putting resources through the federal government that can go into the states to address these issues. And I've done this work. Back when I was in San Francisco years ago, I worked with a woman by the name of Nadine Burke, who I counsel everyone to get her book, The Deepest Well, where she talks about what we know to be true, which is that in communities of color in particular, and this disproportionately impacts women of color who are raising families, we have children who have been exposed to trauma, and it could be a relative has been shot or killed, if the child has been in the foster care system. if a child is growing up with an incarcerated parent, and all of the trauma that might result from that, and how that can also manifest itself in terms of health outcomes, in terms of what we see in objective factors around exposure to trauma and health outcomes. These things are all related. And so when we expect that child to go to school the next day and learn without putting serious effort into helping that child deal with their trauma, it is destined to failure, which is what we are seeing.
I have a couple quick follow-ups for you, Senator. One,
Thank you.
would you broadly use your pardon power as president to release federal prisoners who are in prison merely for drug possession and drug-related crimes? Would you use that on a broader basis than you saw President Obama and previous presidents use?
Well, we certainly have seen this president do nothing about it except try to pardon his friends. So let's start there. But yeah, absolutely. And we have to have the courage to recognize that there are a lot of folks who have been incarcerated who should not have been incarcerated and are still in prison, in large part because, to your point, Joy, they were convicted under draconian laws. They were convicted under draconian laws that have incarcerated them for, in some cases, a lifetime based on what is essentially a public health issue. So yes, I would.
I heard someone call out Colorado when you talked about legalization of marijuana. One of the things that's happening is in states like Colorado, where you do have some legalization, is you still have a stratified system where somebody who has a criminal record cannot get into the industry,
Right.
cannot get licensed to participate.
I
And so
know.
you're seeing a gentrification of legalized marijuana. The industry
You're
is
exactly
open to
right.
people with a lot of capital, with a lot of
You're
cash
exactly
to
right.
spend, and who are then, in turn, also gentrifying neighborhoods. I grew up in Colorado. I can tell you the neighborhoods that used to be very tough neighborhoods are now very expensive.
No,
partly because of
I know,
legalized
you're
marijuana.
exactly right.
What could be done about that?
So first, what we've got to do is, like in my hometown of Oakland, California, what has happened is that there have been policies that have said that the young, invariably a lot of the people who historically were arrested for marijuana sales were young men of color. And so isn't that the irony of it all? That now this is one of the fastest growing money-making industries in our country. And the very young men who were trying to make money doing the same thing, but got criminalized and have now been branded felons for life, are excluded from the economic opportunities that are now available because of this new industry. So part of what has to happen is there have to be policies in place that look at the background and actually do the work of saying that some of those young men should be first in line to get the jobs that are available. And that their felony convictions should not be the barrier to them having employment in an industry that they were a part of before it was an industry.
Thank you for that.
Right? They were ahead of the curve.
Thank you. All right, we have a couple
think
of
we do.
questions from the audience. Let's have the first one. Welcome.
Hi,
How you
Senator
doing?
Harris.
It's good to see you.
I'm Nikema Williams,
Yes.
and I have a little crew with me today.
Yes.
I serve as the Deputy Executive Director of Care and Action, but I'm also a state senator in the battleground state of Georgia.
Yes.
In November, while standing peacefully with my constituents in the Georgia state capitol, demanding that every vote be counted in the historic 2018 elections, I was arrested, along with 14 other Georgians, for making our voices heard. Counting every vote is the basic practice to a functioning democracy. How do you intend to protect Americans' votes and expand participation and access to democracy for everyone, no matter their party affiliation?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. And thank you for your leadership, because Georgia is a battleground on so many issues, and not only about taking the country through the national election, but also we have seen rampant discrimination and abuse and, frankly, violations of the law as it relates to voting rights. And we saw the incredible work of Stacey Abrams there in terms of trying, right? So here's what I say about it. First of all, so elections matter. So forever, we would talk about in a presidential race the importance of the United States Supreme Court. And often in every election cycle, it is the most important, but often, unfortunately, the least persuasive reason for people to care about the outcome of the election is the United States Supreme Court. But we know that there are consequences for who will be president and what kind of court they will shape. So, on this subject, in 2013, the United States Supreme Court wrote Shelby v. Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act. And almost immediately thereafter, states put in place laws to discriminate and to create barriers for folks from voting. And it was targeted at people of color, it was targeted at students, it was targeted at Native Americans. And what we saw around this country, there were at least 22 states that almost immediately after that court decision put in discriminatory laws and laws that were designed to suppress folks' rights to vote. In fact, in North Carolina, the law was challenged to the point that the Court of Appeals, when reviewing the law that legislature passed, said that it was written with, quote, surgical precision to deny folks the right to vote. So it's a real issue and it's a current issue. And so elections matter, both in terms of who is president of the United States and who is the Secretary of State of any given state and who is the governor of any given state. So let's, one, recognize the connection between elections and this issue. Two, let's recognize that until we can correct some of these laws, the way that we are going to get to the goal of ensuring that everyone exercise their right to vote is we are going to have to invest in community. We're going to have to invest in community leadership because we've right now got a lot of obstacles that until we get done with the legislation that is aimed at fixing the problems, until we get done with the litigation that is aimed at, holding people accountable that are suppressing the vote, until we get that done, in the interim, we need to strengthen the community-based organizations that are focused on getting folks registered and helping them to the polls. But hold on, guys, there's one more piece of this. There's one more piece of this. Having done work my entire life aligned with our civil rights community, forever, this is not a new issue, voter suppression, not a new issue at all. Forever we have talked about the way to approach it, about litigation, legislation, and then obviously mobilization and community organization. There's a whole new 21st century version of this that we need to really be clear about. And that is manipulation by foreign governments in our election. Now, be clear. No, wait, but see, so here's the thing. The intelligence community came out with a report of what happened in 2016. Now, let's speak truth, because some people aren't clear about this. Not any of us, we're clear. Russia interfered in the election of the President of the United States. Okay, so the intelligence community has done a report on what happened. Included in that analysis is that an adversarial country who was attempting to destabilize our democracy decided that they would try and interfere with our elections and make the American public insecure and suspicious. And so they decided to target our vulnerabilities. And they exposed America's Achilles heel. You know the issue that they kept bringing up because they knew it would cause heat and dissension among us? Race. So guess what? The irony of it all is that what otherwise we have been always knowing as a civil rights issue has now become a national security issue. And we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it knowing what they did in 2016. Because it didn't result in any real consequence, they will do again in 2020, and it will be about misinformation that is being done with a targeted effort to create dissension, which will lead to suppression because people will just get turned off, and they'll decide, you know what, I don't like any of these people, I'm just not going to vote. So we're going to have to really be vigilant in calling out the untruths when we see them, because I think this is where the power of the people is going to be critical to counteracting what will invariably be efforts to manipulate this election for President of the United States.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. One more, come on, quickly.
Hi. Hello, Senator Harris. My name is Lucy, and I'm with United We Dream.
Yay.
Action. Okay. I'm 18 years old, and I will vote for the first time in the 2020 elections.
That's fantastic.
I have family members who are undocumented and live in danger every day.
Yeah.
As president, what will you do to stop deportation agents from tearing more families apart?
So, first of all, we need a president of these United States who understands that we are a nation of immigrants, and instead of vilifying folks because he's trying to scapegoat folks to distract from the fact that he ain't done nothing, we need to have a president of the United States who understands that if we are going to be true to the values of who we say we are, if we are going to be true to the actual history of what created us and who we are, then we will have a commitment from the President of the United States, which is the President of the United States I will be, that will pass comprehensive immigration reform, that will stop allowing the United States government to commit a human rights abuse at the border, which is what this family separation policy has been. I will be a president of the United States that keeps our word to those dreamers that we gave DACA protection instead of pulling it out. I will be a president who understands that those young people who are DACA recipients and dreamers did not just fall out of the sky onto the earth. They have parents who also deserve protection. And we just need a president of the United States who uses her bully pulpit in a way that understands that if we are going to be strong as a country, we must be committed to our stated values. That's part of what has given us strength on this globe. And right now we are ceding that power when we have a president of the United States that is using that bully pulpit to divide and to sow hate. We've got to end that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator, as a brief follow-up to the last question, what would be your immediate action in the first 100 days related to tent cities and detained migrants and the whole infrastructure that's been set up at the border?
Yeah. So first of all, what we have to do is that there needs to be real resources that are put into allowing these families to have their process for determining their status in terms of, in particular, asylum. And again, we need to, this is the problem, part of the problem with the issue is that it has been mischaracterized by very powerful people. Let's understand what's happening. We have families that are fleeing murder capitals of the world. Most people don't want to leave their home. Like, just think about the nature of it. Most people don't want to leave the place where they were born, where their parents were born, where their grandparents were born, with the place that is familiar to them, the culture that is familiar to them. When people leave, it is usually because they have to. So let's first of all understand the nature of what we're talking about. Okay, so then we are talking about what have been documented to be murder capitals of the world. Then let's talk about the fact that there are families who have made a decision, parents who have made a decision to put their children in what they know could be a perilous journey of traveling through the entire country of Mexico to come to the United States because those parents decided the fate that they are now facing if they stay at home is worse than what they may endure. And then what happens when they arrive at our borders? We who have erected the Statue of Liberty, they arrive at our borders and we say, go back to where you came from. That is inhumane and it is immoral. And so I come at the subject from that perspective.
We are out of time, so we're going to get your first 100 days. You're going to do?
First 100 days, I'm going to pass the LIFT Act, which is what I am proposing is that we change the tax code of this country, and that for families that are making less than $100,000 a year, those families receive a $6,000 tax credit. They can receive it up to $500 a month. This will uplift 1 in 2 American families, 2 in 3 American children. 60% of African American households in poverty will be lifted out of poverty because of this. And the other thing that I will do, if Congress fails to act with smart gun safety laws, I will execute executive action to put in place what is long overdue and people have had the courage to do, or lack the courage to do.
And we're almost out of time, but
Okay.
we've asked every candidate on this stage, why should women of color choose you as a nominee for president?
Because of my track record, my entire life, of focusing on women of color, be it in terms of health care. I am a leader on the issue of maternal mortality that invariably and disproportionately impacts women of color, on my history and long-term work in terms of education, including what I'm proposing right now, which is to close the teacher. There are children in what they know could be a perilous journey of traveling through the entire country of Mexico to come to the United States because those parents decided the fate that they are now facing if they stay at home is worse than what they may endure. And then what happens when they arrive at our borders? We who have erected the Statue of Liberty, they arrive at our borders and we say, go back to where you came from. That is inhumane and it is immoral. And so I come at the subject from that perspective.
We are out of time, so we're going to get your first 100 days. You're going to do
first 100 days. I'm going to pass the LIFT Act, which is what I am proposing is that we change the tax code of this country, and that for families that are making less than $100,000 a year, those families receive a $6,000 tax credit. They can receive it up to $500 a month. This will uplift 1 in 2 American families, 2 in 3 American children. 60% of African American households in poverty will be lifted out of poverty because of this. And the other thing that I will do, if Congress fails to act with smart gun safety laws, I will execute executive action to put in place what is long overdue and people have had the courage to do, or lack the courage to do.
And we're almost out of time, but
Okay.
we've asked every candidate on this stage, why should women of color choose you as a nominee for president?
Because of my track record, my entire life, of focusing on women of color, be it in terms of health care. I am a leader on the issue of maternal mortality that invariably and disproportionately impacts women of color, on my history and long-term work in terms of education, including what I'm proposing right now, which is to close the teacher pay gap, which will disproportionately impact children of color and the women of color that are raising them, for my work on criminal justice reform, my work when it comes to economic security and health for women and women of color, and that includes a number of things, including what I am proposing that we do in terms of closing the pay gap as it relates to women of color, which right now is about 54 cents and 61 cents on the dollar for Latinas and African American women. There is a long history of work I have done, including my mentorship of young women of color in politics and in the professions. And I would stake my reputation in terms of what I will do going forward based on what I've done, and I believe you can judge me that way.
Senator Kamala Harris, thank you so much for joining us here at To the People. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
it goes by fast.
I could be in front of
Senator Kamala Harris, and we'll go.
Thank you.